first question really isn't a question. It's more of a statement. And going back to a conversation that we had on the way driving to Melbourne, but also we've had it before because we've heard the phrase when speaking about someone who has probably experienced some type of moral failure. We've heard the phrase fall from grace. He or she fell from grace, or they fell from grace. We've heard that phrase used, and it always rubs both of us the wrong way when that's used. And in Galatians 5, there is a portion where sometimes that's used to talk about this specific subject, fall from grace. And it says, Paul is saying this, listen, I, Paul, tell you this, if you are counting on circumcision to make you right with God, then Christ will be of no benefit to you. I'll say it again. If you are trying to find favor with God by being circumcised, you must obey every regulation in the whole law of Moses. For if you are trying to make yourselves right with God by keeping the law, you have been cut off from Christ. You have fallen away from God's grace. So just speak to the term fall from grace and specifically how Galatians addresses that what we've learned it to be is actually being used wrong to say someone has fallen away from grace. Can anybody actually fall away from grace?
Well, according to what Paul said there, yes. But it means something very different than the way we typically use it. So, for instance, when I crashed and burned very publicly in 2015, a lot of the commentary about me was that I fell from grace. As Stacie mentioned, it's typically used as a way of describing someone who has experienced some moral failure. And in many cases, it's used to refer to somebody who has experienced some scandalous kind of moral failure. And so, that phrase, you may have used it yourself. I know I've used it. I know you've probably heard it, that this person fell from grace or that person fell from grace. And they're using that phrase based on what Paul said here, but they're using it wrongly, as Stacie mentioned. If you look at what Paul says in the verse that Stacie just read, he's talking about somebody he's not talking about somebody who has failed morally or somebody who has done a bad thing. What he's describing are the people who are no longer depending on God's grace to make them right with God, but depending on their own effort or their own works or whatever it is that they can produce. So in essence, what he's saying is the more you depend on yourself, the more you are distancing yourself from God's grace in that sense. Now, there's another sense in which no one can distance themselves from God's grace. What he's speaking about is experientially, when we depend on what we do, our righteousness, our rightness, our goodness, our works, whatever, to get us in with God, to get God to love us, or to get God to approve of us, we're distancing ourselves from grace. And so what I like to say is that when someone experiences a moral failure of some sort, it's not so much that they have fallen away from grace, but they've fallen into grace, because it's typically when we're at the bottom that we discover who God is and how much God loves us in spite of what we've done or failed to do. And so that's a phrase that is often misunderstood, misused. I even read an article, I don't remember, this was a couple years ago. I was speaking at another conference, and one of these sort of gotcha basement bloggers got wind of the fact that I was speaking, and they're still talking about all of my crap from nearly 9 years ago. I guess it's clickbait, I don't know. But the title of the blog post was something like, "Disgraced Pastor Headlines Men's Conference," or something like that. And I thought, disgraced. Very much the same idea, the way that we typically think about it, disgraced. And the way that they were using that word is the same way that a lot of us have misused fallen from grace, that it's a way for us to describe a bad person, someone who's done a bad thing, somebody who has screwed up royally, and as a result, they have fallen from grace. They have disgraced themselves. And what's interesting about that is we know that grace, a proper definition for grace, is undeserved favor, one-way love coming our way minus our merit. And so if that's the proper definition of grace, then to assume or to believe that we can fall away from it as if we earned it in the first place or we deserved it in the first place, is just, it's a misnomer. It's
literally the definition of grace. So the person who is experiencing moral failure is literally doing something that grace is for. It
Right.
is literally the definition of it.
Right.
Like you only get grace because you don't deserve it.
Yeah, it's
a gift.
Right. Yeah. The
in
only
the face of failing.
that, and really that is the only person who, if you will, is qualified to experience grace is the person who desperately needs it, and that describes all of us. Right. So there's nothing we do or there's nothing we can fail to do that will disqualify us from the grace of God because we were never qualified in the first place.
Which was the whole point.
Which is the whole point. Yeah, that's the whole point. So yeah, I hope that's clear. I know that I sort of referenced that verse when we were going through the series, but as we were driving to Melbourne and talking about this morning, I said to Stacie, I said, I want to kind of go back to that one verse because I want to spend a couple minutes talking about that phrase that is so often misunderstood. Fallen from grace. He fell from grace. She fell from grace. He disgraced himself. She disgraced herself by what she did or by what she failed to do. And that is assuming a definition about grace that is just false.
Right.
Not true.
Right.
So, we
can't ungift it to ourselves.
Right. That's right.
Can't do that.
Yeah.
And
it's a gift, and we can't
gift.
ungift it. Right.
All right.
Did that make sense, by the way?
If you have a question about it, you can save it till the end.
Yeah.
And then you can ask.
Yeah.
This came from one of our non-local church family members, Larry. He's been around for several years. And he asks this question, which I think is a really great one, and I think you will too. Could Tullian please share about the reap what you sow verses in Galatians 6 against the traditional interpretation, giving the overarching, wonderful, and freeing message of Galatians in his recent sermon series? Please help me, and probably others, reconcile with the common evangelical moralistic interpretation of reaping what you sow. At least for me, I've always heard the reap verses discussed in personal moralistic terms.
Okay. So
do you want me
basically
to...
what he's asking is, in light of the radicality of God's grace and everything that Galatians is about, the freedom that we now have, how do we understand the whole reap what you sow concept? Okay, that
do you mean
sounds,
to share those verses?
No, that's okay.
Okay.
That sounds a lot like karma, in other words. You know, what comes around goes around, what you put in is what you get out, that sort of thing. And once again, I think it's important, and I brought this up to the men, I think it was yesterday, maybe it was Friday night, I can't remember. But it is crucially important to understand the distinction between our vertical connection to God, which is solid, unable to be interrupted because of what God has done for us. That is a sure thing. You hear me say this all the time. We live our lives under a banner that reads, "It is finished. We're in forever." Okay? That's something we have to keep in mind all the time, even when we read verses in the Bible that may seem to at least imply that either God's love is conditional or there are certain things we can do or fail to do that will cause God's disposition toward us to change. So when we read those verses or those passages, they can be confusing. Because we go, well, now hold on a second. I mean, if it's true that it is finished and that there's nothing we can do to make God love us more and there's nothing we can do to make God love us less, then what does that mean? And we have to put verses like that, concepts like that, on the horizontal plane. Okay, so I explained this to the guys yesterday. No vertical condemnation, which we love and embrace, does not mean no horizontal consequences. Okay, so for instance, I can talk bad about someone behind their back and gossip about them and just talk trash about them, and I won't sacrifice 1 ounce of God's love for doing that, but I may sacrifice this friendship. I can drive 140 miles an hour down I-95 without sacrificing 1 ounce of God's love for me, because God's love for me is not based on how fast or slow I drive. But I may sacrifice my license if I get pulled over, sacrifice some money. So there are horizontal consequences. When Paul here is speaking about reaping and sowing, he's simply saying there are consequences to every decision we make. Now, those consequences, and this is super important, when we are in the throes of consequences, okay, it was very tempting for me when my life was bad to think that God was punishing me, that he was angry at me, that he was punishing me, that his disposition toward me had changed. But what I was experiencing wasn't condemnation from God. It was the consequences of foolish and destructive decisions. And when I was in the throes of those consequences, even though it was tempting for me to believe that what I was actually experiencing was condemnation, it was very helpful to be reminded by a handful of people that when you're in the throes of consequences, it does not mean the presence of God's condemnation. God's disposition towards you has not changed. Because of what he has done for you, his disposition towards you will not change. And as a result of that, we don't have to worry about how God feels about us. But I do have to be mindful of the choices that I make, because they not only affect me, but they affect the people around me. And in order to experience the freedom that Paul talked about for 6 chapters, I have to be mindful of that. You and I both know that when we are in the throes of consequences because of destructive decisions or destructive habits or whatever, life doesn't feel free. It feels cramped, it feels tense, it feels enslaved. But when we are mindful, and that's really what Paul is describing in the latter part of Galatians, he's describing what freedom on the ground begins to look like and feel like in your life. And as you respond in your life to the grace and the forgiveness that you've been given, you'll experience an increasing amount of freedom. Not that you'll get more freedom, because all the freedom you need, you already have. But it's a lifetime of understanding and experiencing more of the freedom that we already possess. So yeah, I mean, I think that's a great question. It's a great, and that question gives us some insight into how to read the Bible as a whole. Mm-hmm. Because like I said earlier, we read verses and passages that seem to imply, at least, that the way we live affects the way God feels about us. Mm-hmm. And that's not... Those verses and those passages don't belong on the vertical plane. They belong on the horizontal plane. And the fact of the matter is, how I live and what I do does affect the way I feel about myself, or the way other people feel about me, or the way other people experience the decisions that I have made, good or bad. But it doesn't describe the way God feels about us. His disposition toward us does not change, even if other people's disposition toward us does.
That's a great segue into this next topic, I would say. It's not as much a question, but so many Christians I remember this growing up. If things that were happening to you or in your life or in the life of your loved ones were bad, if you were getting bad news, health-wise, if something tragic was happening to you at work or relationally or just in some way, or you were making choices that ushered in bad horizontal consequences, like you were just talking about. A lot of the times Christians look at that as, well, maybe you're not a Christian, or maybe God is not happy with you, or you're being punished for something. A lot of times it's really hard when life is hard to not think that you're reaping what you sow, like we just talked about. And I wanted to go back to Galatians 2, chapter 2. And it says, "For through the law I died to the law, so that I might live to God. I have been crucified with Christ. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. In the life I now live in the flesh, I live by faith in the Son of God, who loved me and gave himself for me." And you didn't go into this detail about Paul, but Paul, being one of Jesus's disciples, and he, to paint a real picture of his life being crucified horizontally, like bad things happening to him, despite him being a Christian, despite Jesus being sending him out specifically, I want you to go tell people about me. I want you to tell people about the gospel. His life had a lot of cruciform moments in it. It wasn't always oh, I get to go to another place, and now I'm going to go to this church, and now I'm going to go to all the churches in Galatia. And I was reading the list of things that happened to Paul in general, and it was Paul certainly knew something about crucifixion. 5 times whipped with the 39 lashes, 3 times beaten with rods, stoned once, thrice shipwrecked.
He only got stoned once?
That's what it says. A day and night adrift at sea.
I got stoned a lot more than that.
Different stoning. Constantly dealing with enemies and false brethren. I hate when I have to deal with false brethren. But it just was striking to me, so often we instantly think I don't have, God's love. I don't have grace. I don't have these things because something bad is happening. And to remember through this, what Paul is saying throughout the whole book of Galatians is, that God only works with that one system of death and resurrection, death and resurrection. Our life is not linear where it's just better and better and better because we're a Christian, but we come up against things that are death in some way to us. We're dying to dreams. We're dying to relationships. We're dying to things being healthy and whole and hopeful at times. And I think that that's one of the places that people get confused, because we are so conditional, and we base God's love for us, his favor for us, his grace to us, his acceptance of us conditionally, because we cannot, and he's speaking to that in so many ways throughout this book about just it's not the same. He's not doing it the same, and I want you to just speak to that.
Well, sure. Jesus himself said to his disciples, in this life, you're going to experience some really hard stuff. Okay? We're broken people living in a broken world with other broken people, and that means that things around us and things in us will break on a consistent basis. Like you said, shattered dreams, broken relationships, lost jobs, whatever the case may be. We experience that stuff. And that is not any indication that God's grace or favor is no longer on you. Jesus promised that. Here's where I think, at least growing up, I heard correctly that this life is not going to be easy, that there will be hard things we experience as we make our way through life. And just when you get out of one thing that's hard and you're feeling a bit of a reprieve, oftentimes you're bracing yourself for the next hard thing, whatever that may be. So I heard that stuff. But Paul, and this is the argument, Paul was suffering because of the good things he was doing, and it was the bad people who were causing suffering in his life because he was bold in talking about Jesus wherever he went. That's not talking about if you do something really stupid and suffer for it, that is God's punishment. So Paul may have not been experiencing God's punishment because he was doing good things. But if you're experiencing suffering for doing bad things, you are experiencing God's punishment. That's where sort of the confusion sets in. And I think it goes back to what, I said a few minutes ago, understanding the distinction between no vertical condemnation does not mean the absence of horizontal consequences, whatever that may be. And one could say that what Paul was experiencing were consequences. They were
right.
Consequences aren't always a bad thing.
Right.
So we experience good consequences when we make good decisions and
right.
bad consequences when we make bad decisions. But I think it's super important to remember that, as I said a minute ago, the line that connects us to God is solid. It's unbreakable. It is something that we can't break ourselves. It's not something that we can alter or change. That has been settled for us. That is why Jesus said, as he was dying, it is finished. All of the work that was needing to be done in order to make sure we are right with God forever has been done. So don't worry about that anymore. Don't worry about your relationship to God in that sense. We can always cultivate a deeper intimacy with God as we pray. That happens as we talk to other people about God, as people talk to us about God. I mean, that, just like any relationship, the more time you spend with somebody, the more intimate it gets, the deeper it gets. But in terms of our relationship to God as an adopted son, an adopted daughter, one who is beloved and loved forever by God, that cannot change. That will not change no matter what you do or don't do. So when you're suffering or experiencing hard things, it's very, very dangerous to think, okay, I must have done something to sacrifice the favor and blessing of God. I mean, it's at the end of the day, that's not just arrogant, assuming that you have the ability to do that, but it's also offensive. I mean, in the sense that God's constantly reminding us that there's nothing we can do that can separate us from his love. I mean, when Paul says in Romans 8:1, there is therefore now no condemnation, he doesn't say there will be no condemnation from God for you if you fly straight. If you dot your I's, cross your T's, clean up your act, stop doing the bad stuff, start doing the good stuff, you put a good track record of that together, then at the end of that line, there will be no condemnation. He doesn't say that. He says there is therefore now no condemnation. Because of what God has done for us. So I just think that when we experience the hard stuff in this life, rather than seeing God as an angry disciplinarian, and we could talk about discipline another time, but rather than seeing God as an angry disciplinarian, it's so much healthier, more right to see him as a sticky friend in the middle of our mess, to see him as a non-blinking friend in the middle of our trouble. Like I said in my prayer, he doesn't promise to rescue us from the hard stuff, but he does promise to be with us in the hard stuff and never leave us and never forsake us, no matter how hard it gets, no matter how bad things get, no matter how bad we get.
I love that.
Do you?
I do love that.
Good.
It's great.
Thanks, honey.
Do you want it's 11:25. Do you want to?
What time is it?
11:25. So you want to see if there are any?
The Cowboys don't play this week, so I can stay here till 4 o'clock in the afternoon for all I care. I did say to a couple of people via group text message this week that Cowboy fans can be sure that we will not lose today and that Dak Prescott will not have a bad game simply because we're not
They don't have a
playing.
game.
It's our bye week. Yeah. We do need the Miami Dolphins to beat the Philadelphia Eagles tonight, though. That's a big game. Yes, that's a big game.
Go Fins.
Yes, go Fins. I'm a diehard Dolphin fan today.
No, ma'am.
Okay, so let's take some questions.
Okay.
Do you mind getting up and walking around for anybody? Is there anybody that
yes,
has
but
a
whatever.
question? We've got a
Is that
couple
Lewis?
people, so
I
let's
can't
start
see.
to the right and then go to the left.
Who had one on the right?
No, don't go to Lewis first. I'm scared.
What?
Go right. No, right. Go right. I'm just
is
kidding.
my right.
That feels much
Gosh.
safer.
Yeah, going back to what you said about falling from grace, just wanted to see if you consider this to be accurate as well. I believe that when you fall from grace, you turn back to the law,
Yes.
and when you fall into grace, you're turning back to Christ.
Yeah.
And,
That's
and
it.
for me, that's been a struggle that I went through most of my. It's religion.
Yeah.
It's turning to religion versus grace. Is that accurate?
Yes, that's very well said. Yeah, and that's really what he's saying there. He's saying the more we depend on the law to make us right, the more we depend on our rule keeping, our religious rule keeping to make us right, to that degree we are distancing ourselves from grace because we're depending on ourselves rather than God. We're depending on our abilities rather than God's grace. So yeah, that's exactly, and Paul makes that clear, which is why it's so interesting to me that we've gotten it so wrong for so long, because it's so clear in there. I mean, the phrase is put in context. We lift phrases or verses out of their surrounding context, and then we develop entire theologies with that stuff. And so it's always important in reading anything, the Bible or any other book, to read your sentences and to read your paragraphs in context of what's being said around it. And what's being said around that particular phrase that we've lifted is that when you turn to your own ability, law keeping, rule keeping, being good, trusting in your own goodness, trusting in your own righteousness, that sort of thing, you're distancing yourself from grace. And that is very much a religious idea. My mom and dad helped me early on, and I know there are nuances to this, but when I was growing up, one of the things that my mom said to me and my dad was that Christianity is not a religion, it's a relationship. And those are two very different things. If we look at Christianity as a religion, then we have to look at it as certain hoops we have to jump through, certain rituals we have to do, certain traditions we have to maintain, that sort of thing. And at the end of the day, as I've said from this platform many times, that religion is really not about God. It's about us. It's about what we do, what we need to do, what we should be doing, what we shouldn't be doing. Whereas Christianity is about a very personal, intimate relationship with God that is only made possible because of his grace.
Okay.
You're welcome.
All right, this one won't be scary.
Thank God.
So over the past 9 weeks, I've learned so much, and my eyes have been opened, and my mind's been open to so much. One of the things that really stood out is when you talked about, and I'm sorry if I get the names wrong, Abraham, how he was forgiven way before the law of Moses was ever introduced. And it was amazing to me. And I talked to my brother-in-law about it. And he's like, the fact that you already understood that is huge from where you are. My question is, because again, I'm just so curious, are there other examples of that pre-Moses law that I could just read and I could learn more about? Because to me, that aced it for me when you said that.
Yeah, that was the Apostle Paul's argument to all of the religious people who were saying you got to keep the law of Moses in order to be made right with God. And of course, Paul says, you guys look to Abraham as like your founder and father, right? They're like, oh yes, Father Abraham, Father Abraham. He said, well, Abraham was 400 years before the law even showed up. Abraham preceded Moses. So how can you claim him as your father, Father Abraham, the founder of your religion, so to speak, if he was made right with God apart from the law of Moses, then why are you telling other people that in order for them to be made right with God, they have to keep the law of Moses? That was his argument, Paul's argument, which was brilliant. Paul knew his stuff, and he knew his Bible, which at that time was just the Old Testament. In terms of other examples, I would say everything in the Bible prior to Moses. I mean, Adam and Eve, for instance, they preceded Abraham by, God knows how many years. And God made them right with him because of his grace and his love. He's the one who covered them. He's the one who made promises to them, the greatest of which was him telling Eve that the seed of the woman would one day come and crush the head of the serpent. In other words, that was all the way back in the face of humanity's greatest failure in the Garden of Eden. God makes a promise. I'm going to come clean up this mess. I'm going to come fix what you guys just broke. And even though that promise seemed ununderstandable at the time, I'm sure Eve was like, the seed of the woman will crush the head of the, what are you talking about? I don't have any indication. There's nothing in the Bible that indicates that they knew what he was talking about. But we know that he was talking about Jesus, that one day, hundreds and hundreds of years later, the seed of the woman, God born of woman in the Virgin Mary, would one day come and crush, put to death everything that the serpent, that was a representative of the devil in the Garden of Eden, tried to screw up forever. And so even back then, we have this amazing promise. So any thought that we can be made right with God, or that God makes us right with him based on our keeping of the rules, or that God loves us more when we're good and he loves us less when we're bad, any impulse we have to believe that ignores everything that God did with people before Moses even showed up.
And it makes what Christ did insufficient. And Paul says that in Galatians. Like,
Yeah.
if you're believing that, then what Jesus has done means really nothing.
Right. What did he
What did he
accomplish?
do it for? Why
Right.
do we
What did he
need him
accomplish?
if we could make ourselves right?
Yeah.
I mean, even in the garden, God spoke a word of grace
Yeah.
to his people then. Like, he was already there. Question?
We got one in the
Somebody?
back. This one
Where?
really,
Oh.
really scares
this
me.
is
Ken,
probably gonna be
please, no
amazing.
F-bombs. We're in church.
Hey, you can-
okay.
We have grace here.
I won't, I promise.
Oh, I
wasn't
thought
gonna
that was
ask
Ken.
Until this guy, it's not Ken. It's
Oh,
her.
thank
How you
God.
doing?
Where's
How you doing?
Ken?
I wasn't going to
Where
ask
is he?
this, but this guy, it's like God prepared my question by his question, because I was going to ask this. Why do you think God chose that period of time to reveal the fullness of his grace? Was it that the people in the Old Testament, from Adam through Moses, through everybody, were they not ready for it? In the same way that a lot of people, even today, just aren't ready to receive that type of grace, that depth of grace understanding.
Yeah, I don't have a really good answer to that, because the Bible doesn't say. It just says that in the fullness of time. In the fullness of time, God sent forth his son, born of a woman. So I know that God had a plan, and his plan was executed to perfection. Why he chose that particular time for Jesus to come. I mean, why didn't he just send him right in the garden? Right after it happened, why didn't he say, you know what, I'm going to fix this right now? There were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds, thousands of years before that promise that he made in the garden came to fruition. Why did he wait so long? What was he doing? Part of the answer could be just, people weren't ready. But then that's not super satisfying, because there were a lot of people who weren't ready when Jesus came, and there are a lot of people who aren't ready today. I do know that it gave God an opportunity to unfold a detailed, colorful plan of redemption. So the entire Old Testament predicts a rescuer, and the entire New Testament presents the rescuer that was predicted in the Old Testament. So I think it was St. Augustine who said, the Old Testament is the New Testament concealed, and the New Testament is the Old Testament revealed. And so it's kind of like, if you look at that amount of time as the amount of time, the meticulous amount of time that God took to paint in detail with the most colorful of colors and the most beautiful ways of expression to sort of almost get us ready so that we can now look back and go, wow, Jesus didn't just show up in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. I mean, there are whispers and shadows of him throughout the Old Testament. And when we read the Old Testament through the lens of the New Testament, we see Jesus everywhere in the Old Testament. Behind every promise, behind every prophecy, we see Jesus. I mean, Isaiah talks about things being really, really bad. The prophet Isaiah is talking about, in his day, this was hundreds of years before Jesus showed up, things in his time being really, really bad. And he says, but I can kind of see on the horizon this vague black and white figure approaching. And I can't totally make out who he is, but I know it's God, and he's on the way, and he's going to fix this stuff. And of course, the consummation of that promise, the consummation of the fulfillment of that promise, happens when Jesus fully and finally comes back, and everything sad becomes untrue, and every tear will be wiped, and all of our frustrations will be wiped away, and we will be made whole. I mean, in that sense, of course, the best is yet to come. Okay. I want to read one thing real quick, because I told Gary that I told Gary Evans I would. You're welcome.
Well, if you
I'm
told
not just
Gary
doing
Evans,
it because
then you have to read it.
I'm not just doing it. Let's see. Hold on. Where is it? I got a sweet. Now, let me say this. If I stood up here every week and read to you the notes and the messages and the letters that we get from around the world on a weekly basis, I would be up here for hours and hours and hours, days. So once in a while, I like to give you guys just a snapshot so that you can see that from this small little town in South Florida, in this little space, what God is doing is literally reaching the world. It's why we have invested money in things like live streaming and video production and social media and all of that stuff. So let me read you this note. I'm going to attempt to do this without my glasses on. No, I can do it. I can do it. I know I can. This person says, Tullian, sir, I am a big fan. I am 13 years old. My dad told me about you, and I listen to your sermons every day. I love the series Scandalous Freedom. It's the best. You are my favorite preacher. Love, Timothy from India. I got that. Yeah, I got that on Facebook in a message.
This week.
We get stuff like that all the time, all the time. So your commitment to this place, your investment in this place, is reaching far and wide, much further and wider than you would think, and it's always a huge source of encouragement.